Welcome back, everyone. This week is Module 8. We're going to talk about Russian Federation, Central Asia, and the Transcaucasus. This is today's lecture outline. I'm going to talk about some physical geography features and climate change, then some early history, especially regarding the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, which is officially called Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and its collapse, and post-USSR until today, socioeconomic, political, and environmental issues. These are some of the key concepts: climate change, permafrost, Northern Sea route, Tsar and Tsardom, Bolshevik revolution, state socialism, Leninism, command economy, collectivism, ethno-nationalism, post-Soviet environmental paradox, and Chernobyl disaster. This is a word cloud created from the place impression survey. I can see words like cold, communism, Soviet Union, vodka, Stalin and Putin, Moscow, large, and interestingly, China and Chinese too. Alright, with these impressions, let's have a close look at. This region is basically consists of former socialist countries under the Soviet Union, but our textbook divided it now into three subparts. First, Russia, which is officially called the Russian Federation, Central Asia, and Transcaucasus. The Transcaucasus is located on the Caucasus Mountains. This region has a vast territory, but very sparsely populated. While the total area is about 21 million square kilometers, the total population is only about 232 million. More than half, about 143.5 million people, are living in Russia. Also, this region has very little influence from the oceans. Most of the ports are icebound. Here's a physiogeographic map of this region. Moving west to east, there's first the Russian plain, and then the Ural Mountains, and then the West Siberian plain, which is low level and marshy, followed by an upland zone called the Central Siberian Plateau, and finally in the far east, a mountainous zone that borders the Pacific. To the south of these territories, from west to east, there is an irregular border of mountains. First, the Caucasus Mountains, desert plateau of Central Asia, and then another mountain ranges, like Sayan and Yablonov that borders China. To the north, this shaded region is a permafrost zone. A permafrost zone is where the subsoil is permanently frozen throughout the seasons. Here in the Arctic tundra, the ice reaches very deep underground and creates a continuous permafrost condition. Below tundra, there is taiga. Taiga has comparatively shallow permafrost zone. By the way, do you have any idea where Sochi is located? The venue of this year's Winter Olympic is right here in the Caucasus Mountains. It's a coastal resort city located along the Black Sea. As you may have read or watched news, it's also a highly disputed area in Russia, bordering the Transcaucasus countries. The climate of this region is mostly continental. Winters are long and cold because of the air current coming from the Arctic. Summers instead are short and warm. Central Asia is very dry, as well as the Transcaucasus region. Because there is not much rainfall, agriculture is very much reliant on the condition of irrigation. It's becoming more of a problem these days because this region, especially the Transcaucasus and North Caucasus, is getting drier and drier. Political disputes of this area is being exacerbated because of changing climate. Overall, the severe climate condition of this region makes climate as a restrictive element to the development of this region. Here I want to show you some photos of some of the physiogeographic regions. First, this is how the Russian plain looks like. It has lots of sedimentary deposits. It's marshy, and this is West Siberian plain, extremely flat, poorly drained, mostly inhospitable, and there are a lot of oil and gas reserves. In Central Siberian Plateau, uplifting, hilly, and they're gorgeous. The Urals instead, it's a very old mountain, so it's very old and eroded, heavily mineralized. And then you have southern mountain rim. It's comparatively younger than the Urals. It also has lots of oil, gas, and coal reserves. Climate change is creating both opportunities and threats. What's seen as exciting but also worrying is the opening of the Northern Sea route. As polar ice cap melts, a shipping route along the northern coast of Russia, which you see right here, is becoming a reality. This is not only a resource-rich area, but also as a trade route that connects Asia and Europe. It's a lot shorter than the very long current shipping route that goes across the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Suez Canal, and then the Mediterranean. So having a northern sea route would enormously save the cost of transportation. Russia is especially keen on this climate change and the opening of the sea route, northern sea route, as it will bring a lot of economic opportunities in the future. As countries like China, Norway are experimenting this route with icebreakers and container ships, Russia is intensifying control over the area. Territorial disputes over the ownership of the Arctic has already begun. What is worrying, then, is environmental impacts that the opening of the Northern Sea route is going to bring about. The Arctic has been relatively intact from human influences. It is obvious that the Northern Sea route, as it becomes popular and more ships and people use it, will cause pollution and also disturbance to the existing ecosystem. International guidelines or regulations that can restrict activities in the Arctic is becoming more and more necessary. Another threat from climate change is the release of methane from the thawing of permafrost. In the article published in Nature, Whiteman et al. Say that there is a 50 gigaton reservoir of methane on the East Siberian Arctic shelf. A warmer climate will cause more release of methane. As we discussed in the Module 2, methane's global warming potential over a 100-year time span is about 25 times higher than carbon dioxide. Whiteman et al. Also argue that this potential is not fully considered in the current global climate modeling, indicating that global climate may change a lot quicker than what we anticipate right now. I posted this journal article on Carmen. It's only 3 pages, so have a read if you're interested. I will come back to more environmental issues of the region, but before that, let's have a close look at some history and human geography. Before the Soviet Union, there was the Muscovite Empire, or you can call it the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire lasted for 400 years. In the 15th century, Muscovy was a part of the larger, bigger Mongol Tartar Empire. Then in 1552, they defeated Tartars, got independent, and very aggressively expanded their territory, as you see in this map. Their territory reached to part of the northern Europe, the Transcaucasus, Central Asia, part of Far East, and Alaska. The Russian imperialism is distinct from European imperialism in that, rather than looking for colonies overseas, it targeted adjacent continental countries. The expansion was driven by Russian emperors who wanted more land and a warm water port and more subjects to rule. These emperors were called Tsars. The Tsars were Orthodox Christian, especially as Rome and Constantinople of the Byzantine, which is now Istanbul in Turkey, had all fallen by the mid-15th century. They claimed that they were the only legitimate heir of the Orthodox Church. As you read in this textbook, many territorial disputes within this region stem from different beliefs, different religions. For instance, Muslim and Jews are a minority and have a long history of being persecuted by the Russians. The Russian Empire witnessed Europe's industrialization, and they wanted to industrialize themselves too. Alexander II abolished the serfdom in 1861 with an anticipation that freed labor from landlords who could now own their own land would help to build a market economy. Also, the Trans-Siberian Railway was built in 1904 that prompted development of the Far East and exploitation of natural resources there. The effort of industrialization seemed to be successful, but simultaneously the discontent among the people was amounting, as the Tsars were not interested in resolving social issues that accompanied economic transition, economic development, such as displacement of peasants from farmland or increasing wealth gap. Then it was the beginning of the 20th century that Russia was severely hit by economic recession. Inflation and unemployment made people's lives very hard. The situation got worsened as Russia also participated to the World War I. Industrial growth got slower, factories closed down, and the price of commodities kept going up. Hunger was prevalent in some regions. Most importantly, the Tsars were completely incapable of dealing with these situations. Soviet literally means council or assembly. The socialist revolution against the Russian Empire was led by Soviets, who are local councils of workers, who then were mostly dominated by the members of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party. Actually, there were two revolutions in 1917. Following the February Revolution, there was this famous October Revolution, which is also called as the Bolshevik Revolution. It originally started as the strikes by industrial workers, and peasants joined as they protested against the landowners. And then intellectuals and middle-class citizens also joined the movement. The Soviets overthrew the empire and set up a new socialist government. But spreading the socialist power took time, and it wasn't without conflict. The revolution was followed by the Russian Civil War, which took almost 5 years. The Soviet Union was finally established in 1922 by Lenin. Its official name is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This is the world's first socialist state. This legendary leader who founded USSR, Lenin, in the image, the guy on the right is Lenin. Lenin was an idealist. He wished to realize a society where everyone is equal and collectively owns everything. He interpreted Marxism as a practical political theory, which is called Leninism. He led the revolution, and after the revolution built a state that's run by a democratic organization of the proletariat. Lenin was also an internationalist. He acknowledged diversity of different ethnic identities within the USSR and supported their political independence. He thought socialism can seamlessly glue all the nationalities under one flag of socialist ideal. The countries under the USSR were united based on this membership of the Communist Party. Stalin, who is the guy on the left, was the next leader of the USSR, and he was different from Lenin. After all, he wasn't a merciful leader. By his order, about 30 to 60 million people were purged for resisting the Soviet power or for expressing their own nationalism. He nationalized all the assets and imposed a standardized lifestyle to everyone regarding the populations, regardless of the population's social and cultural differences. State socialism is a form of economy based on principles of collective ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods, dominated and directed by state bureaucracies. It has a number of characteristics. First, the planning economy or central planning. A new economic plan was set up by Lenin in 1921. This plan put key industries, foreign trade, and banking under the state control. And the idea of state control of the economy was intensified during the Stalin regime. In command economy, all aspects of production and distribution are centrally controlled by government agencies. What is so well known is the establishment of territorial production complexes. Each complex aims at producing a particular product, for instance, cotton in one area and steel in another area. The complexes were designed to maximize production by allocating related industries based on the production sites of natural resources. As we're going to see later, and also you're going to do the virtual fieldwork activity, the case of RLC shows that, and other examples, they all show that this strategy turned out disastrous because resource exploitation became excessive, and actually the selected industry for that particular site was not very suitable for the environment, leading to depletion of resources. Stalinist socialist economy is also notorious for its collectivism and authoritarianism. To speed up industrialization, Stalin first collectivized farming so that he could create an army of labor and maximize labor force. This became a foundation of Stalin's success of industrialization. Meanwhile, concentrating heavy industry at the expense of agriculture was pretty common. People's lives were radically reorganized around production and were compelled to follow a standardized style of living. Cities under the Soviet regime were also developed in a particular way. Urban forms, the ways in which cities are spatially constructed, and people's living organized around these spatial patterns were very different from that of Europe, Latin America, or the US. You will learn more about it as you do this week's virtual fieldwork activity. And finally, under the Soviet regime, there was a significant movement of people. First, the Bolshevik Revolution and the Civil War caused diaspora. It was a global diaspora. People moved abroad, especially to the US. Russians under the Soviet system were also encouraged to move and settle in new areas of the new Russia, such as Baltic, Siberia, Far East, Central Asia, and the Transcaucasus, in order to spread out Russian influence. When the Soviet Union was dissembled in 1989, about 25 million Russians suddenly became ethnic minorities in these newly independent countries. On the other hand, a lot of ethnic minorities were also forcefully moved to a remote, less populated region. As we will see, this unspontaneous migration is another source of territorial conflicts in the post-Soviet Union era. The period when the Socialist Front, represented as the Soviet Union, and the Capitalist Front, represented as the United States, were confronting is called the Cold War. Cold War lasted about half a century, from 1950 to 1989. As we discussed the other week, the power of the United States had grown during this period, and it helped the US to achieve global hegemony. Then what about the Soviet Union, the power of Soviet Union? Actually, the Soviet power was also influencing different parts of the world. This map shows which countries were US allies and which countries were Soviet allies. not just its satellite states in Eastern Europe, but China, India, Afghanistan, Algeria, Libya, Angola, and other countries in Africa, as well as Latin American countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Panama, were all allies of the Soviet Union back then. As not much was known from the outside, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a surprise to the world back then in 1989. Now we know better. It turns out that the Soviet system was already showing a sign of crisis by the 1970s. First, the collective production system was incapable of adapting to technological advances. The strategy of planning economy was also inflexible to global industrial development, and their products could not compete in the overseas market. An informal economy, which exists outside the planning economy, functioned like a capitalist market economy, and those informal economy was growing. On the other hand, inequalities were increasing among the newly created groups of social stratifications and within regions, different regions. The Soviet Union so broke down between 1989 and 1991. 15 independent countries were formed. Excluding the 3 Baltic countries, the other 12 countries are now called the Newly Independent States, or NIS. This period was not just liberating, but a time of suffering too. Agricultural and industrial production had a sharp decline. Economic output was down by 4% in 1990, and then 10 to 15% down in the first half of 1991. Ethnocultural nationalism and separatism intensified, followed by bloody civil wars in some of these independent states. Former USSR countries are facing a task of building a market economy. After about 70 years under the planning economy, it's not an easy task at all. The existing economy was weak and uncompetitive. The Soviet system left inefficient industries, poor infrastructure, and lack of capital. Regulations were also weak. Basic market institutions were non-existent. The political situation was still unsettling too. The governments of the newly independent countries were already occupied with dealing with lots of ethno-nationalistic conflicts. Rapid introduction of market economy in this context caused a lot of issues and problems. Bureaucracy got easily corrupted, crime rates got higher, and most importantly, the industrial assets that were established during the socialist regime got concentrated through not very much transparent routes to the hands of few people who had political economic power to become super rich so quickly. These oligarchs have monopolized key industries such as oil, gas, and mining. Post-Soviet region is composed of 15 independent countries, as I just said, but this number may still increase. This region is very diverse in terms of ethnicities. In Russia only, there are 92 distinct ethnic groups, including Slavs, who are the majority. As I mentioned also earlier, the Soviet regime after Lenin had forcibly suppressed these minorities not to display their own national identities. When the regime became weak, the ethnic tensions just burst out. Although some groups were successful to be an independent nation, some could not. So not only Russia, but the newly independent nations in Central Asia and the Caucasus, ethno-national territorial conflicts still exist. Different ethnic groups possess different languages, cultures, and religions. A dominant language in Russia is Slavonic, while in Central Asia it's Turkic. or Turkic. In the Caucasus, three languages, Abkhaz and Chechen, Dagestani, and Georgian languages, are mostly spoken. In terms of religion, a dominant religion in Russia is the Orthodox Christianity, while in Central Asian countries it's Islam. Ethno-nationalism means a nationalism based on ethnic identity. Here you can notice that a nation by definition is not necessarily equivalent with a more modern sense of a country or a state. We often use nations and states as synonyms, but here's the difference between a state and a nation. A state or a country is a political entity that is self-governing and have a sovereignty over its territory. When we say states, like in the United States, a state can also mean a sovereign entity that consists of a federal system. On the other hand, a nation is a group of people who share a common ethnicity, language, religion, or culture, and as such have a distinct and strong collective identity. In this sense, we use the term local nationalism to refer to a movement of an ethnic group in multiple parts of Russia, Central Asia, and the Transcaucasus, who strive to achieve political and sociocultural independence of their own from an external influence. The local nationalism leads to territorial conflicts. Especially troubling sites are North Caucasus of Russia, where Sochi is located, and Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, and South Ossetia in Georgia. Read more about their stories in the textbook. Okay, let's come back to the environmental issues of today that this region is facing. Considering that the climate and geomorphologic conditions are not favorable, but a limiting factor to agriculture or industrialization, the ways in which the Soviet regime exploited the natural resources caused lots of problems. The Soviet ideology towards nature was to conquer it. Nature was often viewed as something brutal that humans need to win over. The central planning system worsened the situation by mislocating an industry to where the biophysical environment is actually not very suitable, or by overexploiting resources to maximize production. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union, competing with the US, also conducted numerous nuclear experiments and built nuclear plants. These are all environmental legacies of socialism. A post-Soviet environmental paradox then refers to the situation where these destructive legacies have been rather intensified than ameliorated after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Introduction of a market economy was based on flimsily established environmental regulations, and in effect, environmental issues were largely overlooked because of economic growth was the first and foremost priority. And the results were devastating and are devastating. The problems of pollution and resource depletion are prevalent across the region. For instance, the Aral Sea dropped about 33 feet during the past century due to excessive irrigation because of the problem of monoculture. You will learn more about the situation of the Aral Sea as you do the virtual fieldwork. This map that I brought from the textbook shows a degree of environmental degradation of this region. Red-colored sites mean that the degradation is irreparable, meaning that the environment cannot be reversed to its condition before the Soviet regime. Blue-colored sites are where degradation is severe. You also see orange lines, which signify rivers that are heavily contaminated. And also you see these black dots. They are where nuclear damage exists or a potential for future damage exists. I bet most of you have heard about the Chernobyl accident. Chernobyl is located right here. in the territory of Ukraine, very close from its border with Belarus. Okay, so now I want to talk a little more about nuclear contamination issue. The Soviet expanded nuclear weapons and nuclear power after 1950. The types of nuclear contamination included fallout from above-ground testing, nuclear explosions for seismic testing and oil exploration, dumping of nuclear waste, and construction of nuclear plants. What is the most notorious case of nuclear contamination is the accident, which happened in a small city of Chernobyl in April 1986. It happened when a reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant got cracked because of an accidental power surge and started to melt down. Clouds of radioactive material were blown northward through the sky because of the direction of the wind. About 60% of fallout actually hit today's Belarus region, and the consequence was disastrous. About 100,000 square kilometers around the site were significantly contaminated, and 25% of Belarus became uninhabitable. A radius of about 30 kilometers from the site are still designated as an exclusion zone, and about 1,000 villages were abandoned completely. The impact of Chernobyl nuclear disaster is lasting. Second and third generations of affected populations are suffering from physical and psychological illnesses. When I was a child, I remember seeing horrifying pictures of deformed babies and animals on TV, like one-legged pigs or three-eyed horses. It's estimated that over 15 million people have been victimized until today. And what happened in Chernobyl, that is considered the world's worst nuclear accident. It prompted a global anti-nuclear movement. The Fukushima accident of Japan in 2011 is considered the second worst. We see that almost 30 years after Chernobyl, we are still depending on nuclear power for the reason that it's a cheap energy source. But as we continue to use it, we and our future generations live with the possibility of witnessing or experiencing another nuclear disaster. Okay, this is the end of this week's lecture. Please understand that the lecture cannot cover every detail in the textbook. So, to be fully prepared for the comprehension quiz, read the textbook thoroughly and take the self-check quiz.